Nestled in the furthest western point of Middle-earth lies the Grey Havens and the elves of Lindon that reside there, the other High Elven faction in the game alongside Imladris, who we have already had a look at, and also the faction in Middle-earth that are probably least likely to get involved in any ongoing conflicts at the main period of time that the game is based in. Having said that, you can still take to the field as these High Elves, led by the bearded elf as they are here, Círdan the Shipwright, and indeed they're very different mechanically to their fellow High Elves, unlike the two Sylvan Elf factions that have quite a lot of crossover. Lindon and Imladris do of course share the sort of basic elven traits that all of them do, but the way in which they go about it is the most different among all of the elven factions, despite their relatively close proximity and shared ancestry. The story of the Grey Havens and the Elves of Lindon as well extends right the way back to the Silmarillion, and Círdan himself was there as well, back when they were the Philathrim, and that was probably the period of time where they were most active, at least in terms of warfare, especially compared to the time period that we're concerned with. But if they were to march to war once again in one final act of defiance, they are the furthest away from the dark heart that exists within Mordor, but even though they have quite a long way to travel, they would probably do most of it by boat. But of course Medieval 2 doesn't have any active ship combat, which is a bit of a shame. Of course, in the single player games, Lindon do have a tendency to be the most powerful of the naval factions, which means that they can actually traverse quite a lot of the map without having to mulch their way through what is primarily friends all around them, for the most part anyway. But their army as a whole, as we will be looking at it, let's have a look at some of the strengths and weaknesses that you can come to expect. And the reason why I did Lindon now is because, much like Rohan that we saw before, they weren't really in a particularly good place in the last version of the game, but that is much improved now as a result of a few of the tweaks. Again, I think it's more overall tweaks that really do benefit Lindon. They do have more roster changes actually than Rohan did, but again, it's more of an overall mechanical shift which is going to be to Lindon's benefit. As a result, in terms of the wording at the very least, their strengths and weaknesses are still very similar to what they were before, and the main one is very high melee defense for Lindon. Of all the factions in the game, Lindon's melee defense on average is going to be the highest, and they need that for reasons that we will get into a little bit later on, but suffice it to say, if you're involved in a straight up fight which comes down to weapon craft, up close and personal, or even further away in terms of the damage they're able to dish out, then you are going to be in trouble. And if Lindon can dictate the pace of the battles to really take advantage of their really high melee defense, then generally speaking they're going to do very well against pretty much everyone they come up against. There will be a few that will be able to go toe-to-toe with Lindon a little bit more so. Again, other very high melee defense factions tend to do reasonably well against them, but even then, Lindon will tend to outpace them either by a little or by a lot in this respect. And one thing that they can back this up with as well is the fact that pikes and javelins tend to be a weapon that they traffic in. Now, as far as a singular pike unit goes, Lindon's pikes are actually not as potent as the forces from Imladris or from Lothlorien. However, you can field them in far greater numbers than their elven cousins, and that does make a significant difference, because as you're building up your front line with your pikes, you are going to need to have that density of them if you're going to use them in a more universal sense than their elven cousins. And when you back that up with the javelin numbers that you can also utilise as Lindon, with more than one unit of javelins, unlike again the other elves which either have none or only one unit, and they all tend to be quite expensive, and that is true of Lindon as well. But that density of numbers with both of these two unit types gives them a pike and shot kind of feel, which is of course very useful when you're digging in. It's very useful when it comes to trying to make up for the fact that you're going to have lesser numbers than many of your opposition. But it also means that you're going to be able to use them perhaps more aggressively as well, and it gives you an option in a siege battle where, typically speaking, the lower elven numbers can be a bit of a problem, but these two unit types really will help you with that. And the other type of unit that I think does bear mentioning here as well is their swordsmen, and this shouldn't really be too much of a surprise, because when you consider units with very high melee defense, you do tend to think about swordsmen, and in terms of elven factions in general, you tend to think of, in particular, their two-handed bladesmen as being some of the finest, if not the finest, warriors that Middle-earth has to offer. But I think it does really bear repeating with Lindon because their sword and shield units and their two-handed swordsman units, when you consider the very high melee defense, and even, they do combine it with some heavily armored units at the high end as well. That folding in of those strengths really means that they really do favour that finesse. If you have that baseline throwing units and pikes and javelins and that sort of thing at the centre, they can be your basis, and then you can deal the damage with all of the bladesmen and all of that sort of thing that you have around them. You can really swamp forwards. That's also true on horseback as well, when you consider that the strongest of Lindon's cavalry units is also a bit of a rarity when it comes to the lancer knight units, in the sense that they have that lance with that big charge, as well as wielding a two-handed blade as well for that extra bit of punch in melee. But we'll talk more about those units in detail when we actually talk about Lindon's roster up close and personal. But Lindon are not without their weaknesses, and this is what really defined them in the last version of the game, I think. Not so much now, but all of them do still bear repeating. And the first, as I'm sure you will notice, is the very light armour that Lindon have. They are the most lightly armoured faction, certainly in terms of their cost, that the game has to offer. And this does come actually with an upside in the fact that armour-piercing units tend to have lower offensive stats to offset the fact that they're designed to punch through armour. All of these units, and factions that revolve around these units, tend to do quite poorly against Lindon in melee because the boost that they would normally be receiving from these weapon types is no longer present. However, generally speaking, armour is a universal defensive bonus because it will allow you to withstand pressure from projectiles slightly more, which is certainly a weakness that Lindon have. If they get caught up in a situation where they're getting shot and they can't really respond to it very well, they have their own projectiles which are very damaging, but they can definitely find themselves under pressure in that regard, and that's where their lighter armour values can be a real problem. It's also very useful pretty much universally in melee. Even against armour-piercing units, having armour does still give you a defensive boost. It's just far less effective than it would otherwise be. So the fact that it's not there, for most of their units, Lindon do have a couple of armoured units, but across the board they're very lightly armoured. And as much as you have the very high melee defense to make up for that, and if you can control an engagement, that will definitely be a boost. Melee defense can be counteracted by units being surrounded, and if they're getting attacked not from the front, so if you're losing control of an engagement, your melee defense can start to be not as effective, nowhere near as effective as it would otherwise be, whereas armour does still apply in these situations. So as much as having that skill, peerless skill really among all of the factions within the game, there are ways for oppositions to counteract it, and one of the ways in which they will do that is to try and take advantage of, I've referred to it here as low mass. I mean, I could have just referred to it as low numbers, but I feel as though with Lindon, because of the fact that they really like to utilise those strong pikes and, guard their throwing projectile units behind, and the fact that they want to utilise their melee defence like I just mentioned, if you can smash their lines apart, which you can certainly do with all of the Elven factions, but particularly with how lightweight Lindon are, this is one of the things which it'll be like a red rag to a bull really when it comes to certainly some of the higher number Orcish factions who really don't want to be getting involved in a trading battle with Lindon in pure melee terms, because Lindon's skill will allow them to carve through lower tier Orcs if they can set themselves all day long. But if the Orcs can smash those lines up, start taking away the advantage of their big melee defense and getting in and around them, then you could be in trouble as Lindon. And this is also a problem for when you're digging in a defensive siege. I mean, if you're doing your due diligence as Lindon, you should be able to prepare your lines well enough to the point where this shouldn't be too much of a problem, but you should always be on the lookout for this sort of tactic. It doesn't have to be the Orcs as well. Pretty much every faction in the game is going to have access to greater numbers than you if you're playing as any of the Elven factions. It's only really when you're going for some sort of kin-slaying civil war that this might not be the case. Indeed, Lindon have got a few more mid-tier numbers perhaps than their nearby High Elven brethren in Imladris, but even then, Imladris have got chunkier units. They're going to be able to deal with that sort of pressure a little bit better perhaps than Lindon, and it's one of the things that you definitely have to be on guard against on the field or in a siege. And also the low mass means that you're going to have to be very careful when you're attacking in a siege. You need to set yourself and do things in stages a little bit more, rather than just swarming forwards like you can with certain other factions. And all of this is compounded by the fact that, as with every Elven faction in the game, your army is going to be very expensive. Your entry-level units are reasonably priced for what they are, though again, smaller in number. though when you get up to the higher tiers, you very quickly find yourself spending more than other factions would for units that are smaller than other factions. You do, of course, gain in terms of stats and in terms of finesse, and many of your units, if you utilise them correctly, are going to be very, very impressive indeed, but there is maybe a finer line with Lindon than we saw with Imladris. Imladris can fall back upon their armour in a way that Lindon cannot, so you have to be a little bit more assured with Lindon, but I think throughout all of these strengths and weaknesses, and when we go to look at their roster in general, Lindon do have a few more sneaky options than Imladris do. I think Imladris are always going to play very much according to strength and quality at the high end in a very straightforward manner, whereas Lindon, you're going to have to utilise a few other tactics, I think, but if you utilise them well, then you could find yourself doing damage at an extremely high rate and your opponent floundering a little bit in the face of what you can do. But I think that will be better got across when we have a look at their roster up close and personal on the grassy plain. So on the face of things, Lindon's roster is a little bit more compact than a few of the factions we've been looking at a little bit more recently, but that isn't necessarily the case. A lot of the factions that we've seen in the past while have had access to one or two units at least that have access to a unit that changes appearance when you upgrade its armour, but Lindon, of course, as perhaps you would expect given the nature of the faction, does not have any armour upgrades within its faction. There are only a couple of units that come with very heavy armour in the first place where there wouldn't be a purpose to upgrading it anyway, and the rest of them, the faction is designed around the fact that they are a little bit more lightweight in nature. Also, the tiers of elven units work mostly differently to a few other factions. The dwarves, of course, have got a few similarities, and a couple of the Numenorian ones do as well, where the entry-level unit could hardly be, well, the entry-level tier couldn't really be considered low. It sort of starts at mid-tier and then goes up into higher and higher tiers, as it were, and this is reflected in the cost as well. So we'll start off with the selection of infantry units that Lindon have, and as we get into the higher tiers we will start to notice this is where they do have some examples of some heavier units, but we will start off with the Lindon infantry, which in typical entry-level elven fashion, as we've already seen slightly with the Swords of Rivendell over from Imladris, when it comes to straight up 1v1 combat, these guys are going to be very effective against most entry-level units from other factions, because again, when you look at these stats, I mean, an attack of 10 is significantly higher than what most mainline units are going to be able to accomplish from other factions. And when you twin this as well with that defensive skill, leaning focus that Lindon have across all of their units, really, so the total defense of 23, with a lot of that being bound up in their defensive skill, means that if you're going up against them with a unit that is a little bit lightweight in terms of their stats, they are going to struggle to make an impression in a fair fight against Lindon. Now, of course, you can get around that by the fact that, as with most elven units in general, based on their tier, the downside is going to be the amount of men they have in their unit. When you consider that a lot of other factions have got access to units at their entry level that are going to have numbers close to or beyond 200, and the Lindon infantry only have 134, that is going to be a concern. So keeping your shape in the face of pressure is going to be key to make sure that you can use every ounce of the stats that even these more basic of Lindon units do have. 550 is not a huge amount of cost in the grand scheme of things. Many factions have access to a tier of units entirely which will be cheaper than this. But for the most part, when it comes to units that enemies are going to be reliant upon, this is pretty much where it starts. It's just the fact that this is where you're going to have to try and make up the bulk of your numbers. The shield value on these guys is not terrible either. A shield value of 8 means that from the front at the very least, you are going to have some sort of defense against missiles, although again, much like with melee defense, when you get surrounded, the shield value does not come into effect when you're getting shot in the back by archers, so the angle of an engagement can make all the difference as well. But as much as they are lightweight, Lindon, in terms of their armour, the shields on the units that have them can help to mitigate some of the weaknesses that they do have in this regard. That isn't something, however, that the next tier on upwards of infantry can rely upon either, because both of the units on this level don't have a shield, which of course comes with its downside, but it will also come with its upsides, as we shall see. The Mithlon Swordmasters being the rather typical, really, example of a heavier elven swordsman, at least in terms of their weaponry when it comes to Lindon. All of the elves have got access to a unit like this, where you can really rely on them to be that damage dealer at the centre of your army. And they will achieve this in a couple of ways. One is the fact that their attack and charge bonus is high. So the attack of 17, and if you can land the charge as well of 15, as I've mentioned several times already in these faction overviews, a little bit more difficult to do with infantry on foot than it is with cavalry, but still, it does still exist, and it is a big boost on the initial stage of an engagement if you can land it. But the thing with these Lindon swordsmen as well, especially considering that they cost 700, you're rarely going to find a unit with a defensive skill this high for a cost this relatively low. And that's one of the only times that I'm going to mention that sort of cheap, cost-efficient nature of an elven unit, really, because for the most part, you do pay for what you get, and on this occasion, I mean, it does come with the downside as well, that you have no shield value, and an armour value which is a very lowly 5 for a cost this high, so it's definitely a two-sided blade, that, and it does mean as well that enemy missile units are definitely going to be trying to focus down a unit like this, because they are going to be very dangerous to the vast majority of opponents that they face in melee. Again, if you manage to get into an engagement that is in your favour and you've managed to control the battlefield well, this is exactly the kind of unit that can perform extremely well against a lot of other units. You know, units on the same tier or lower than this will really struggle to make an impression in pure melee, especially if they're backed up appropriately by some of Lindon's support units. However, if they get into a situation where they're getting shot up or surrounded in an engagement, that is where things can start to come, where you can start to come undone as Lindon as a whole, and this is perhaps one of the better units. This tier of unit in general actually is one of the best examples of what Lindon are good at and how they can also be come unstuck a little bit. But yeah, big attack, big defense in the right situation, very efficient for the cost. In the wrong situation, can melt away quite quickly, so you've got to be careful with them. And another good example of this is the more defensively minded Mithlond pikemen. We've already mentioned them in the strengths and weaknesses. We listed it as a big strength actually, because the elven factions in general cannot hide behind a phalanx formation. Lindon can, however. Now, in comparison to many other pikes from other factions, again, one of the downsides is going to be the fact that they don't have that many men in the unit. 113 is relatively low, but they make up for this in a number of ways. One is the fact that many standard pikes, especially when you consider they only cost 650, which especially in comparison to the other elven factions, with their admittedly better but much more expensive and also much more low numbers pikes, as we'll talk about in a moment, these stats are still very good compared to the vast majority of standard human pikes, for example, or certainly standard orcish pikes and the like. And that can really help make a difference, because most pikes will tend to do their damage relatively slowly. They tend to be almost entirely an anchoring unit and a defensive unit, and any damage they do is a bonus, but you're going to have to win the battle in other ways. That isn't necessarily true with elven pikes. Many a time we've seen elven pikes get into formation and a pile of bodies form in front of them far more quickly than you would expect. And I mean, an attack of 12, considering the formation, the phalanx formation itself being so potent, is something that can be very useful. The defense as well. Most pikes, once their formation is broken, will tend to melt very quickly, especially entry-level pikes. But the Lindon ones, as much as a mass push is still pretty toxic to them, the defensive skill of 10 does mean that you do have more of a window of opportunity for salvaging a situation, perhaps, where your lines are starting to fail than other factions might. And of course, what sets them apart from the other elves is the fact that you can have 4 of these guys before the cost increases. The red limit, which you can bump into fairly early on with certain kinds of units in this new version of the game. But the fact that you can have 4 of these guys means you can form up a full front line, even on a very open map like the Grassy Plain, and have a solid front facing your enemy. And it means as well that you may not be bullied quite so easily by opposing phalanx units as they may like to. But going for a slow burn approach against Lindon is definitely a bit of a risk for the reasons we've already mentioned, because it allows them to dictate a pace a little bit more easily, and that can be the be-all and end-all with them. 650 is relatively low cost, as we've mentioned as well, but again, beware of enemy missiles. Again, armour value of 5, no shields, very vulnerable. However, Lindon are not completely without some of the memories of the Noldor of old, and here we have the Noldorin Guard with their very heavy armour. The Noldorin units in general certainly wouldn't look out of place in Imladris in terms of what their focuses are. Pretty expensive at 800, but not beyond the pale when it comes to costs, not too dissimilar to the likes of the Imladris Guardians. The other elven factions as well, which we'll get onto at a later date, have got their own equivalents of this kind of unit. But inspiration of nearby troops is useful. I mean, the elves will tend to mentally outlast their opponents in a fight that is still competitive, so if your lines are starting to creak and crack, it's a sign that things are going a little bit wrong for you. But certainly I think now in this new version of the game, morale is a little bit more dynamic, so any inspiration units that you have, parking them on the front line is useful, and that is where the Noldorin Guard will be, especially when you consider they make for pretty much the perfect foil for the Mithlon pikemen just in front of them. 123 men, which normally when we get up to the higher tiers of factions, that's where the numbers start to rapidly fall off, but it's not too dissimilar to the units in front of them, to be honest, given the way that elven factions work. Frightening nearby enemy infantry is also a useful one. It means if the enemy start to run out of steam against your front line as Lindon, then they can start to flee the field just that little bit more quickly. But the attack score of 13 is not bad for a unit like this. I mean, considering how resplendent you look, you might expect a little more, but they're not a bodyguard tier unit. It's worth mentioning they are merely a very high tier infantry unit, but it's that total defense value where they really shine, because of course they have very high defensive skill, also a very nice shield value as well, being a shielded line infantry unit. That's to be expected from Lindon, but they also pair this as a rarity among the faction with a high armour score as well of 11, so you have that total defence score of 35, which is well rounded as well. It's not overly pointed in one direction, and it really does help them be that bulwark on the front line, whether you're moving forward being a little bit more aggressive and they need to absorb a bit more damage, or whether they are acting as the shield in front of the rest of your army to really be that first line of hardy defence. And then the bodyguard infantry unit that Lindon have at their disposal, the mighty Noldorin Blade Masters, one of the scariest units of their type in the game. Again, they have the inspiration and fear that comes with being this class of unit. 63 men, so of course as a bodyguard tier unit they are going to take a bit of a whack in terms of the amount of men in the unit, and that's because, as with pretty much anything that's considered a bodyguard unit in the game, it has that second hit point, so you effectively have to kill them twice in order to bring them down. A few units of this class do have 3 hit points. They are rare, but they do exist, but where the Noldorin Blade Masters kind of catch up to them in some respects is the fact that they have that mightily high total defense of 38, which is mostly in defensive skill with 26, but an armor score of 12 is also very high, so in terms of their baseline stats they are very, very well accomplished indeed. And of course as a swordsman they may not have armor piercing, but they have a very high base attack of 26, and as with most shock infantry units on foot within the game, they have that charge bonus of 15, and if you land that on top of the attack they already have, they're going to be very, very effective. I don't know, I couldn't make any sort of claims about what is the best unit in class for each various type of unit, but two-hander swordsmen, the Noldorin Blade Masters, have always been there or thereabouts, and of course in terms of the high end of quality, all of the elven factions have got some sort of hat to throw into the ring, so to speak, and this, on foot at the very least, is Lindon's. Very, very nice looking units as well, the Noldorin. Now, the supporting units of Lindon, which are very important because you need to, if you're going to dictate the pace of a battle, that very often takes place first at the very least at range, and for close to mid-range you have the Lindar Mariners, one of 2 javelin units that Lindon have at their disposal, the lighter of the 2 variants, and also wielding a spear as their secondary weapon. So they have a bonus fighting cavalry and melee. Cavalry is going to try and clatter into javelins as and where they can because of the armor-piercing damage that javelins can deal, and the Lindar Mariners are no different in that respect. So the spear will help to ward them off, and elven spears, even lowlier elven spears like the Lindar here, are able to at least hold their own in melee, and the Lindon elves tend to do that as well, and primarily with defensive skill, which for a unit of entry level by elven standards javelins, a defensive skill of 11 is pretty damn high. You can see however that the armor value of 3 is low, but when it comes to at least dealing with that initial volley of arrows that are going to be coming their way, they do have that shield value of 8, which helps them out. Missile attack of 7 is nice, it puts them a step ahead of many of the very low end javelins that are in the game elsewhere, and a melee attack of 8, honestly, again, the stats on these guys is not really the problem. The main issue as well with most elven units is going to be the numbers, and when it comes to ranged units that means less DPS per volley unless you're in a really good position and unless you haven't taken any casualties at the point where they are being committed, and that can vary greatly depending on the kind of battle that you're in. But javelins are a big part of what Lindon do. They're an excellent supporting unit for their front line, and the Lindar can hold down the flank nicely as well with those spears on an open field. And we have the equivalent archer as well, which is pretty much the same in every respect. The melee stats are slightly in favour of the javelins, but that's to be expected because they're more of that frontline force that you're going to be wanting to see initially. Lindar bowmen are going to be hanging back a little bit more. Interestingly enough, they can make shield wall, which is kind of interesting because they need to use up all their ammunition to, well, in order to see that that's the fact, you would need to use up the ammunition to easily know that that's the case without seeing it beforehand. But it's interesting as a little extra nonetheless. Again, the lower numbers means the DPS on these guys is not going to be quite there. And in terms of skirmishing back and forth, this is going to be not such a strong point for Lindon because of the low armour that they have. Although if you are going to try and engage in a skirmish fight, the Lindar bowmen need to be a part of it because the only other options you have are horse archers or far more expensive rangers, which, again, you don't want to be really getting involved in that sort of cost trade, really. Lindon really want to be dictating the pace of an engagement, from further back, forcing the enemy to move as they want rather than getting involved in a bit of trench warfare, so to speak. But the Lindar bowmen will do what most entry-level elven archers will do. They will deal better damage than the equivalent from the kingdoms of men or orcs or dwarves. Missile attack of 6 is one higher than most other entry-level archers, but there are fewer of them, lower armour. Need to be careful with them in that respect. They're not going to be something you can send into the meat grinder and expect to do well. Now, another very important unit for them are the Mithlond Marines, and this is because slightly better in terms of a javelin unit. They've got a missile attack of 10, and overall their melee stats are going to be more. I was thinking about putting them in with the infantry, honestly, the rest of the Mithlond units, because they really wouldn't look out of place there. They are effectively a line infantry unit combined with a javelin unit, and I think they're going to be pretty much a must-bring for Lindon, because you're going to be able to do plenty of damage with those javelins, and then they are going to be very useful in melee as well. When you consider that their stats, melee attack of 12, total defense of 28, weighted towards the defensive skill again, but again, shield value of 8 means they're not defenseless against arrows from the front, and a recruitment cost of 700, all of that bound up into one package. You have to bring them, really. Again, the typical Lindon weaknesses of low armour and relatively low numbers for what they are, although when you're getting into this sort of cost, other factions' javelins start to taper off in terms of their numbers as well. But a very important unit, this, because you need to back up your pikes, you need to back up your aggressive infantry, also your cavalry, as we'll see in a moment, can be free-flowing, but you do still need a sure place to stand to start with as Lindon when you're on the open field, certainly. But yeah, like I said, kind of a hybrid unit, but considering the fact they don't lack any ammunition that the Lindar Marines in front of them don't have, they're more of an all-out javelin because that's what they really bring to the table. Like, if you really needed to, the Harlindon infantry could be used in the same role on the front line, but yeah, very good multifaceted unit this, and Lindon do need them. When it comes to dealing damage, however, Rangers are pretty much still, even though they've now lost their body-piercing projectiles, which was kind of a, I don't know, cheesy is maybe the wrong word for it, but it was very much a crutch for the defenders to utilise. Like, the game has been rebalanced around the fact that the defenders hopefully won't need to rely on such things anymore. Rangers are still very, very important, however, when it comes to dealing damage to the right kinds of units, because they have big missile attack. Missile attack of 9 is very high, very big range on them as well, big damage, and yeah, just in general, when it comes to trying to really dictate that damage at long range, the Wardens of Elos Tyrian are going to be an absolute must-bring. I mean, when you consider as well their melee stats, melee attack of 16, total defense of 24, again, massively weighted towards their defensive skill, but that is because they are a dual-wielding unit in melee as well. So they're not going to do very well when they're put under pressure from enemy archers. You really want to be only utilising them when they're not going to get shot up by enemy line archers, for example. 800 is decently expensive for them as well, but if you keep them safe, they will pay that back and then some. If you don't, then you're feeding into the enemy basically when you don't need to. But yeah, fantastic unit this. I really like the look of them as well. They're simple, but the silvery cloaks are a nice look. Lindon have also got access to a very multifaceted cavalry force. I mean, each one of their cavalry units tends to do one thing specific. Well, the first two are sort of hybridization, sort of blunt opposites to one another, and then they've got more aggressive units just in behind. Starting off with the Lindon Riders, which are a combination of horse archer and spear cavalry units. So this means horse archers, pretty much self-explanatory. They're going to be, as elven horse archers tend to be, damaging from afar, a little bit more range, pretty much the same as the Riders of the Broinen in that respect. However, main difference between them and the Imladris Riders is the Lindon Riders are going to be a little bit more flimsy when it comes to taking enemy arrow fire, again a result of that Lindon light armour, which is a little bit of a problem for horse archers because that tends to be a weakness of theirs anyway, and it's only exacerbated by the lightness of their garb. But the fact they have a bonus fighting cavalry is very nice. You know, a lot of horse archers, it does tend to be the case that you can get bullied by enemy cavalry, or at least shoved away from some ground that you can't afford to give up. The Lindon Riders can stand their ground, however, and really give it back to whatever cavalry unit is going after them. Now, you know, obviously very high-end cavalry is still going to defeat them, but Lindon has options when it comes to that regard. So as long as you support these guys, they can definitely be a very important map control tool, which for Lindon, you know, you're going to need to take that where you can get it, because if you allow yourself to get hemmed in, then it's going to be a problem for you in the long run. And then the other cavalry unit that they have, 900 is a lot for a unit like this as well though, so you do have to use them well. The other option that they have, another unit that costs 900, are the Mithlond Lancers. Now weirdly, Javelin Cavalry is usually the sort of unit which you would say is outright anti-cavalry cavalry. That is still kind of true, as if you send them in tandem with the horse archers, it means that you've got all your bases covered. You've got long range, mid to short range, and then close range against enemy cavalry. But these guys do not have a bonus against enemy cavalry in melee. Instead, what they have is the typical charge bonus of what you would expect from a regular unit of lance cavalry. So you could even say that even with their javelins, they're a little bit more designed around dealing with overly defensive infantry forces. Now, I don't know how effective that would be in a siege necessarily, but on the open field, especially if you're alongside cavalry-heavy allies, this is the sort of unit which can be a little bit of a Swiss Army knife, because you can still go after enemy cavalry with those javelins, and then when the time comes in the late game, you can lower those lances and really start digging into the enemy forces that remain. And you know, that can be pretty invaluable later on, but you do need to utilise them at just the right time, because enemy cavalry will do quite nicely against them. Even with the defensive skill, it does give you that leeway to get them out of melee just that little bit more easily. But again, they also still have the same weaknesses that the horse archers have, in the sense that they have relatively low armor, decent shield value on them, mind you, but they're still not going to do too well if they get zoned out by opposition foot archers. Now then, something which is a unique thing among the elves for Lindon is the chariots, the Mithlond nobles. The chariots across the board in the game are a bit of an interesting one, in the sense that they all do pretty much the same thing. The stats, you can pretty much discount them, kind of. As soon as you've seen them work, you'll know what I mean by that. These are the stats which kind of make chariots work. I mean, the others, you will see minor variations, but effectively these are the stats to make it so that chariots are not completely unkillable, like destroyers in melee that will just run through lines, but also not so weak that they will die on contact. You need to keep them moving. If you do that, they can cause havoc in the enemy, and it can be the case that, especially when you consider the map control cavalry that Lindon have, you know, the pikes that they have as well, the chaos that you can sow with the Mithlond nobles means that you can dictate that pace, as I've said, is so important. If you get it wrong, however, 1300 is a lot of gold to flush away, basically, and that is a problem. The Mithlond nobles as well, one thing that differentiates a lot of the chariots in the game is their missile attack. You know, some of them have bows, some of them have crossbows. Lindon have javelins, which I think is one of the better ones, because it does mean that if enemy cavalry tries to slow them down, they're going to get a face full of javelins first of all, and big missile attack on them as well. There's not very many of them, so it's not a huge swarm of javelins that's going to be hitting the enemy, but each one of those is very likely to result in a kill, even on some high-end cav or on some high-end infantry as you go charging towards the lines. So very difficult to quantify chariots. You know, they are an all-or-nothing kind of unit, but it is still interesting that Lindon have them. You know, a lot of the other factions that have access to chariots tend to be a little bit more comfortable when it comes to taking damage and going on the front foot and trying to use the gaps that they create, but Lindon have to be a little bit more deliberate with their use, but it can work. I have seen it before. Now then, Elven Cavalry at the very high end is very, very impressive. Horse Lords of Ulmo are no exception. When it comes to comparing them to the likes of the Gwaith Rokdor or the Sons of Aeol, as we've seen before, the armour is what is slightly less, but the melee defence of 21, that second hit point, 1500 is what you can expect to pay for the very best cavalry that the game has to offer. Charge bonus of 20, attack of 8. Of course, the thing that I have mentioned already is the fact they have that two-handed blade in melee when it comes to dealing with other cavalry as well, so they do have a little bit of bite against enemy cavalry forces up close and personal. And of course with that defensive skill as well, that can be a real problem for them. As with most high-end cavalry, they inspire troops, but that's going to be a little bit less universally useful than it would be for the infantry, as I've said before. Bonus against cavalry, effectiveness against armour off the charge, brightening nearby enemy infantry as well, which is far more useful when it comes to mulching enemy forces with a hammer and anvil charge, which Lindon can engage with, of course, with that pike line from the front, and with their numerous cavalry options from behind, with the Horse Lords of Ulmo being at the very tip of the spear. Now then, something a little bit more simplistic, because this is true of every elven faction, and the colour scheme is really the only thing that changes. The artillery they have at their disposal is a basic ballista, which, as we've seen in the recent tournament, is very good for dictating the pace on an open field, especially when both teams want to be a little bit more cautious. When it comes to a siege as well, you can use it to break down fortifications or set up in a nice defensive position. It is more dependable than most artillery in the game, but it lacks that high-end punch that some of the catapults can deliver, obviously the trebuchets as well, some of the specialty artillery as well, like the mangonel or the dragon's breath, that sort of thing. Again, 1,000, and for an artillery crew they can defend themselves against cavalry well enough, decent enough stats, but as far as an artillery crew goes, the elven forces, maybe it's a little bit less exciting than some others, but dependability in this regard is probably something that the elves can afford to engage with, considering that most of the rest of their roster, especially at the high end, is full of some of the best units and in some ways some of the most risky units that the game has to offer. So there we have it, Lindon as a force. I mean, I do still think that among all of the elven forces, they are still the one with the highest learning curve. They have access to some tools which are a little bit more, familiar perhaps to players of other factions, with the pikes and javelins, of course, have been long known as a very dependable unit in the field. Lots of high-end units as well, but the low armour, the low numbers as well, the combination of all of the things that Lindon are weak at do cause a lot of pitfalls, which I think a lot of people do fall into, whereas the slightly more ranged nature of the Sylvan Elves and the slightly more bulky nature of Imladris can bail you out of a little bit more. But there's no doubt in my mind that Lindon are in a far better place than they were in the last version of the game. The entry-level cavalry being much more useful now, and just in general, the makeup of the units and the way that the red limits work in particular, with their swordmasters and with their pikemen and the javelins that they have around them as well. Not every faction can field the number of units of the class that Lindon can in the numbers that Lindon can, and as much as individually they're going to lack that manpower, it's all about building that force, that dependable centre with the garnish around the outside, shall we call it. That, I think, is probably the only way that I can put it, to be fair. So yeah, there we have it, Lindon, the second of the 4 elven factions that are in the game. I think now it's time that we take a step back to the evil forces of Middle-earth. I'm going to try and link one faction to the last in some way, and obviously everyone knows Lindon for their light armour, and you couldn't get much further away in Middle-earth than the next faction, which also has a lighter outlook when it comes to defending themselves. Next time I think we will do the Southrons of Harad. So I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll join me for that.